My name is Elena Richardson, and I'm writing this in 2025 at the age of 66 from my office at the headquarters of Richardson Family Services, a nationwide network of crisis centers that has helped over 40,000 survivors of family violence. The irony of my surname isn't lost on me. The very name that once represented my deepest shame has become synonymous with hope for thousands of women who thought they had none left. But this story begins 46 years ago, on a November night in 1979, when I was 22 years old, and still believed that family meant safety. That was the night I learned that the two men who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework could transform into predators who would steal my innocence, my trust, and nearly my life. What I'm about to tell you happened in a small farming town in Indiana, where everyone knew everyone's business, and secrets were currency traded over coffee at the local diner. It's a story of unimaginable betrayal, of survival against impossible odds, and of the miracle that saved me when I thought salvation was impossible. I need you to understand something before we begin. Every word of this is true. Every conversation happened as I've recorded it. Every detail has been seared into my memory by trauma so profound, it changed the very structure of my brain. The medical records exist. The court transcripts are public. The scars, both visible and invisible, remain as proof of what I endured and what I overcame. Stay with me through the darkness that's coming. I promise you, there's light at the end. But first, you need to understand how completely that light was extinguished, and how close I came to never finding it again. Millbrook, Indiana in 1979 was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Population 4. 200 nestled between cornfields that stretched to every horizon. It was a town where your grandfather's reputation could still open doors, and your family's shame could follow you for generations. Our house sat on 15 acres of prime farmland, a white two-story colonial that my great-grandfather had built in 1923. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the east side where the foundation had settled, and the kitchen still had the original hardwood floors that creaked in a pattern I'd memorized by age 5. It was home in every sense of the word, warm, familiar, filled with the accumulated comfort that comes from 3 generations of the same family, living and loving within its walls. I was 22 that autumn, fresh out of Ball State University, with my elementary education degree, teaching first grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school where I'd learned to read and write 20 years earlier. Mrs. Patterson, my own first grade teacher, was now my colleague, and she delighted in telling anyone who'd listen how proud she was of little Elena Richardson becoming such a dedicated educator. Elena, honey, you remind me so much of your mother at that age," Mrs. Patterson said during our morning coffee break in early October. Margaret had that same gentle way with children, that natural instinct for knowing exactly what each little one needs to succeed. She was right about the resemblance. At 22, I was almost a carbon copy of my mother. At the same age, auburn hair that caught red highlights in the sun, green eyes that my father claimed could see straight through to a person's soul, and the kind of smile that made strangers feel like old friends. But more than physical appearance, I'd inherited Mom's nurturing nature, and her absolute belief that every problem could be solved with enough patience, love, and homemade cookies. Margaret Richardson was the unofficial mayor of kindness in Millbrook. At 49, she taught Sunday school at First Methodist, organized the annual charity drive that funded the local food bank, and somehow managed to remember everyone's birthday and anniversary. Her apple pies were legendary at church socials, her advice was sought by half the women in town, and her laughter could fill any room with warmth. "You know what your problem is, Elena Marie?" she'd tease me while we folded laundry together on Sunday afternoons. "You care too much about everyone else and not enough about yourself. You need to find a nice young man who'll appreciate that golden heart of yours before some smart woman snatches up all the good ones." I'd roll my eyes and remind her that I was perfectly happy focusing on my teaching career, but secretly, I treasured these moments of ordinary motherly nagging. Mom had a gift for making even mundane tasks feel like precious time together. And I never imagined how desperately I would miss her gentle interference in my life. My father, Robert Richardson, was 51 years old, and every inch the strong, silent type that small Midwest towns specialized in producing. 28 years at the Caterpillar plant in nearby Peoria had left him with shoulders like a linebacker and hands permanently stained with grease and metal filings. He was a man of few words but consistent actions he'd never missed, a day of work never forgotten to fix whatever was broken around the house, and never failed to slip me $20 before I left for college visits with the gruff instruction to buy yourself something nice, kiddo. But Dad carried invisible scars from a childhood he rarely discussed. His father, my grandfather, Thomas Richardson, had been what people in those days politely called a hard man with a heavy hand. What we understand now as severe physical and emotional abuse was simply accepted as tough parenting in Depression-era farming communities. Your grandfather never learned how to show love without using his fists. Mom had explained to me once when I was 16 and asking questions about why we never visited Dad's side of the family. Your father swore he'd be different, and he has been. But sometimes I see shadows in his eyes, old hurts that never quite healed properly. That's why he works so much, staying busy, keeps the dark thoughts away. I'd filed that information away as one of those adult complexities I didn't need to fully understand yet. Dad might be emotionally distant, but he'd never raised his voice to Mom in my presence, never showed anything but patient kindness to me. And the worst I'd ever seen from him was a tendency to drink one too many beers while watching Cubs games on summer evenings. My brother Mark was 3 years older than me, and convinced he knew everything about everything worth knowing. Where I was cautious and studious, Mark was all swagger and charm. He'd inherited Dad's build, but Mom's gift for conversation could talk his way out of any trouble and into any girl's heart with equal ease. Mark worked as a mechanic at Henley's Auto Repair, came home every evening with grease under his fingernails and stories about the ridiculous ways people had managed to break their cars. He had a laugh that could be heard 2 rooms away and an endless supply of jokes that ranged from clever to completely inappropriate. "Elena's got herself a secret admirer," he announced at dinner one evening in September, grinning at me across the table. "Billy Henderson asked me if you were seeing anyone, said he might want to ask you to the Harvest Festival dance. My Mark Richardson, you mind your own business?" I shot back, but I was smiling. This was our familiar rhythm, his gentle teasing, my mock indignation, our parents' amused observation of their children's eternal sibling rivalry. But beneath the surface teasing, Mark had always been fiercely protective of me. When Tommy Kowalski had pulled my braids in 3rd grade, Mark, a 6th grader at the time, had cornered him after school and delivered a lecture about respecting girls that left Tommy stammering apologies for a week. When I'd had my heart broken by my high school boyfriend, Mark had shown up at my dorm room with ice cream and terrible jokes until I laughed despite myself. "Nobody messes with my little sister," he'd say whenever someone asked about his protective streak. "Elena's got enough love in her for the whole world, which means somebody's got to make sure the world doesn't take advantage of that." We weren't a perfect family. Dad worked too many overtime shifts and drank a little too much beer on weekends. Mark had a temper that flared when he felt disrespected, and he'd been in more than a few bar fights over perceived slights. I spent too much time buried in books, and not enough time learning practical skills like car maintenance or home repair. Mom sometimes worried herself sick over problems that were completely outside her control. But we were solid, connected by invisible threads of shared history, inside jokes, and genuine affection. We ate dinner together every Sunday after church, exchanged thoughtful gifts at Christmas, and automatically closed ranks when any outside force threatened one of us. At least that's what I believed until cancer crept into our lives like smoke under a door, silent and deadly and utterly unstoppable. Mom's diagnosis came on February 14th, 1979, Valentine's Day, which would forever after taste bitter in my mouth. Stage 4, ovarian cancer, the kind that hides in silence until it's too late for anything but prayers and chemotherapy treatments that felt more like torture than healing. The doctor says we caught it early for stage 4. Mom told us that evening, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. That means we have time to fight this thing properly. I'm going to need all of you to be strong for me to help me through what's coming. Can you do that? We could and did, rearranging our entire lives around treatment schedules and good days and bad days. I moved back into my childhood bedroom to help with household management and medical care. Dad took early retirement to drive Mom to appointments when I couldn't get away from school. Mark stopped going out with friends on weekends, spending Saturday afternoons instead reading to Mom or helping her tend the flower garden she refused to abandon. For 8 months, we fought that cancer with everything we had. We celebrated tiny victories, days when Mom kept down solid food, weeks when her hair started growing back, moments when her laugh sounded almost normal again. We endured crushing defeats, emergency room visits, setbacks that erased months of progress, the gradual recognition that we were losing ground faster than we gained it. Mom died on October 20th, 1979, on a Tuesday that dawned crisp and beautiful, mocking us with autumn perfection. Her last coherent words were, "Take care of each other. Promise me you'll take care of each other." We promised, never imagining how catastrophically we would fail to keep that vow. The funeral 3 days later brought half of Millbrook to pay respects to a woman who had touched countless lives through simple acts of daily kindness. People shared stories about Mom's generosity, her wisdom, her unwavering faith in the goodness of others. The Methodist Church overflowed with flowers and tears and testimonials to a life well lived. "Your mother was the heart of this community," Pastor Williams told me as mourners filed past the casket. "Her legacy of love will live on through the lives she touched, especially through you children who carry her spirit forward." But what Pastor Williams couldn't see, what none of us could see, was how Mom's death would unleash something monstrous in the men she'd left behind, something that had been held in check by her presence, but was now free to emerge from whatever dark corner it had been hiding in for decades. The first sign should have been obvious, the way Dad and Mark started looking at me differently in the weeks following the funeral, their gazes lingering too long on my body, their casual touches becoming less casual and more possessive. But grief makes people act strangely, and I was drowning in my own sorrow, too overwhelmed by loss to recognize the predatory shift happening right under my nose. I was about to learn that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the faces you've loved most in the world, speaks in voices that once sang you lullabies, and strikes when you're too broken by other losses to defend yourself effectively. The first warning came on November 8th, exactly 19 days after Mom's funeral, during what should have been an ordinary Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, a mindless task that provided small comfort in the routine normalcy it represented. The warm water and familiar motions helped quiet the constant ache of missing Mom, and I was humming one of her favorite hymns without really thinking about it. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." The melody seemed to hang in the air, filling the silence that had settled over our house like dust on abandoned furniture. Dad appeared behind me so quietly that I didn't hear his approach until his reflection materialized in the window above the sink. In the glass, his face looked different, somehow older, harder, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before Mom's death. "You sound just like her when you sing," he said, his voice rough with what I assumed was grief. His hand settled on my shoulder fingers, pressing into my collarbone with more weight than necessary. Same voice, same way of moving around the kitchen. "Sometimes I turn around expecting to see her instead of you." I glanced back at him with sympathy, understanding how disorienting grief could be. "I miss her too, Dad. Every day feels wrong without her here." But instead of the shared moment of mourning, I expected his grip tightened on my shoulder, his thumb beginning to trace small circles along my neck in a way that made my skin crawl with inexplicable unease. You're all we have left of her." He continued his breath, carrying the sharp scent of whiskey, not unusual in itself as he'd been drinking more since Mom's death. But there was something different about his demeanor tonight. Something that made every instinct I possessed scream warnings I didn't yet understand. "You're going to have to take her place now, Elena, in all the ways that matter." The words hung in the air like a threat disguised as a request, and I felt my entire body go cold with a fear I couldn't yet name. I pulled away from his touch, busying myself with drying the plates while trying to process what felt like an entirely inappropriate conversation. "I can help more around the house," I said, carefully not looking at him directly. "With cooking and cleaning and things like that? I know it's been hard managing everything without Mom. That's not what I meant." His voice had dropped to a whisper that seemed to echo off the kitchen walls. "Margaret took care of all my needs, Elena. All of them. Now that she's gone, someone else will have to step up. Someone who loves this family enough to make sacrifices." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow, and I turned to stare at him in shocked disbelief. This was my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had attended every school play and parent-teacher conference, who had cried when I graduated from college. Surely I was misunderstanding what he was suggesting. "Dad, I think you've had too much to drink tonight," I said as gently as possible, trying to give him an excuse to retreat from whatever line he was approaching. "Why don't you go to bed and we can talk more tomorrow when you're feeling better?" But instead of backing down, he stepped closer, trapping me between his body and the kitchen counter. In the harsh fluorescent light, his face looked like a stranger's familiar features, rearranged into an expression I'd never seen before. Hungry and entitled, and completely foreign to the father I thought I knew. "I haven't had nearly enough to drink," he said, his hand reaching up to stroke my hair with a touch that felt nothing like paternal affection. "Not enough to forget what I've lost, not enough to stop thinking about what I need. What we all need." Before I could respond, before I could process what was happening, Mark's voice interrupted from the kitchen doorway. "Is everything okay in here?" he asked, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what he was interrupting. When I looked at him, really looked, I saw the same hunger in his eyes that I'd just witnessed in Dad's, the same predatory assessment that made me feel like prey being stalked by wolves I'd mistaken for family dogs. "Just having a little chat with our Elena about family responsibilities," Dad replied, without taking his eyes off me. "About how things are going to work now that it's just the three of us?" Mark nodded, as if this conversation made perfect sense, as if they'd discussed it before, as if my consent was completely irrelevant to whatever they'd decided among themselves. "Elena's always been good about doing her part," Mark said, moving to block the kitchen's other exit. "Haven't you sis always willing to help family when they need it most?" I was trapped, physically cornered, between two men who suddenly felt like strangers wearing my family's faces, psychologically overwhelmed by the realization that they were coordinating this approach, planning it, expecting me to simply accept whatever they had decided was going to happen. "I need to grade papers," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin and desperate even to my own ears. "I have school tomorrow and the kids are depending on me to—" "The kids will be fine." Dad interrupted, his hand now cupping my cheek in a gesture that should have been comforting, but felt like a brand burning against my skin. "But your family won't be fine if you don't start taking your responsibilities seriously. Your mother understood what it meant to be the woman of this house. Now it's your turn to learn." "That night they raped me." I need to say it plainly without euphemisms or gentle language, because what happened in my childhood bedroom between 11:17 p.m. and 12:43 a.m. on November 8, 1979, was rape in every legal, moral, and human definition of the word. My father held me down while my brother violated me. Then they switched positions while I lay paralyzed by shock and pain and the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about love and family and safety. They didn't use physical force beyond what was necessary to overcome my resistance. There were no dramatic bruises or obvious injuries that would require medical attention or explanations to concerned friends. Instead, they used psychological warfare, the authority of their positions in my life, and my own financial dependence to ensure my compliance. "This is how it is now," Dad explained afterward, adjusting his clothing with the casual demeanor of someone who had just completed a routine household chore. "Mom's gone and families have to adapt. We all have needs, Elena, and we all have responsibilities to meet those needs. That's what love means, taking care of each other, no matter what. If you try to tell anyone about this," Mark added, his voice carrying the patient tone he might use to explain car maintenance to a customer, "they won't believe you. We're respected members of this community, and you're just a young woman who's been unstable since losing her mother. Who do you think people will trust?" They left me alone in my ruined bedroom, surrounded by the innocent decorations of my childhood stuffed animals and participation ribbons and photos of happier times when these same men had protected me instead of destroying me. The physical pain was manageable, but the psychological devastation was so complete that I couldn't even cry. I just lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how my entire world had been redefined in the space of less than 2 hours. This was my new reality. I was no longer Robert Richardson's daughter or Mark Richardson's sister. I was property, a resource to be used when needed, a warm body to fill the void Mom's death had created in their lives. And according to them, this transformation was not only natural, but necessary, my duty as the surviving woman in a grieving household. The worst part, the detail that would haunt me for years afterward, was how normal they acted the next morning. Dad made coffee and read the newspaper just like always. Mark complained about having to work Saturday overtime just like always. They spoke to me with the same casual affection they'd always shown, as if nothing fundamental had changed, as if they hadn't just destroyed the person I used to be. But everything had changed. I was no longer Elena Richardson, beloved daughter and sister. I was Elena Richardson, victim and prisoner, trapped in a house with 2 men who had proven they were willing to use violence to get what they wanted from me. And this was only the beginning. The morning after my rape dawned gray and cold, November frost covering the cornfields like a death shroud over the landscape I'd once found comforting. I woke up on my bedroom floor where I'd collapsed after they left my body aching in ways that had no names, my mind struggling to process what had happened as anything other than the worst nightmare of my life. But the evidence was undeniable. Blood on my thighs, bruises on my wrists where they'd held me down. The nauseating scent of their bodies still clinging to my skin despite the scalding shower I'd taken before dawn, scrubbing myself raw in a futile attempt to wash away what they'd done. Downstairs, they sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast as if nothing had happened. Dad buttered his toast with mechanical precision, already dressed for his shift at the plant. Mark stirred his coffee and glanced through the sports section, humming tunelessly under his breath. The normalcy was obscene, a performance of innocence that made me question my own sanity. "Morning, sweetheart," Dad said without looking up from his newspaper. "Better hurry if you want breakfast before school. Mrs. Patterson called. Sounds like they're having some kind of parent emergency meeting today about the new reading curriculum." My throat constricted around words I couldn't form. He was acting as if nothing had happened, as if my world hadn't been destroyed, while he satisfied his twisted needs. I managed to mumble something about not being hungry and grabbed my teaching bag, fleeing to my car before either of them could see me fall apart completely. The drive to Millbrook Elementary usually took 12 minutes through familiar farmland and residential streets. That morning, it felt like navigating an alien landscape where every landmark mocked me with memories of innocence I could never reclaim. How had I driven this route hundreds of times without noticing how isolated it was? How far from help? How easy it would be for someone to disappear without anyone noticing for hours. At school, I moved through my first-grade classroom like a sleepwalker leading reading groups and reviewing math worksheets, while my mind replayed the previous night in agonizing detail. My students' innocent faces blurred together, their questions sounding like they were coming from underwater. "Miss Richardson, are you feeling okay?" asked Jennifer Morrison, a precocious 6-year-old with pigtails and gaps where her front teeth used to be. "You look really sad today." The simple observation nearly shattered what little composure I had left. Children were intuitive about adult emotions in ways that terrified me now. If a first grader could see that something was wrong, how long before other people started asking questions I couldn't answer? "I'm just tired, sweetie," I managed to respond, forcing what I hoped looked like a reassuring smile. "Sometimes grown-ups have sad days, but that doesn't mean anything is wrong with you or your friends. Now who can tell me what sound the letter B makes?" During lunch break, I locked myself in the supply closet and sobbed silently into boxes of construction paper, terrified that someone would hear and ask questions I couldn't answer truthfully. Who could I tell Dad was a respected veteran who'd never missed a day of work in 28 years? Mark was charming and popular, the kind of guy who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and always had a smile for everyone he met. And I was just Elena Richardson, the quiet school teacher who still lived at home with her family, financially dependent on their goodwill for basic survival. In a town where reputation was everything and gossip traveled faster than wildfire, who would believe such an outrageous accusation against two pillars of the community? I could already hear the whispers. "Poor Elena. She's been unstable since her mother died." Grief can do terrible things to a person's mind. She's always been too sensitive, too emotional, too willing to see problems where none exist. The mathematics of credibility were stark and unforgiving. My word against theirs. My obvious emotional distress against their decades of community standing. My youth and dependence against their age and authority. I would lose before I even opened my mouth. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson cornered me in the teacher's lounge during our planning period, her weathered face creased with genuine concern. "Elena, honey, you've seemed distracted lately," she said gently, settling into the chair beside mine with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested every position change. "I know losing your mother was devastating. Margaret was one of the finest women I've ever known, but you're worrying me. You look like you haven't slept in days." The opening was there, the invitation to confide in someone who'd known me since childhood, who'd taught 3 generations of Richardson children, and might understand the complexities of family dynamics better than most. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The rape, the threats, the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about love and safety. But then, I imagined saying the words aloud. "My father and brother attacked me last night, and they said they'll do it again whenever they want." I watched in my mind as Mrs. Patterson's kind face crumpled with disbelief and pity, as she struggled to reconcile such monstrous accusations with the men she'd known and respected for decades. "I'm fine," I lied, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "Just adjusting to life without Mom. It's harder than I expected, but I'll manage. I always do." She patted my shoulder with maternal sympathy and suggested I might benefit from talking to Pastor Williams about grief counseling, not knowing that sharing this particular burden would destroy more than it healed. I thanked her for her concern and returned to my classroom, where I sat among children's artwork and educational posters, feeling more isolated than a castaway on a desert island. That evening, I tried to barricade myself in my bedroom, pushing my dresser against the door and wedging a chair under the handle. But the house was old, the wood soft from decades of settling, and determination born of twisted entitlement was stronger than furniture. They came again at 11:30 p.m., Dad picking the simple lock with a paperclip, while Mark moved the furniture aside as if it were made of cardboard. This time, there was no pretense of explanation or justification, just the efficient brutality of men taking what they believed they were owed. "Fighting just makes it harder on everyone," Mark observed afterward, straightening his shirt with the casual air of someone who'd just completed routine maintenance on a piece of machinery. Mom never fought Dad when he needed comfort. She understood what being a woman in this family meant. The comparison to Mom made me vomit not metaphorically, but literally violently into the wastepaper basket beside my bed while they watched with detached interest. They'd corrupted even her memory, twisting her loving marriage into justification for their violence against me. "Clean yourself up," Dad instructed before they left. "And remember, this is family business, private business, the kind of thing that stays within these walls no matter what." Sleep became impossible after that. I lay rigid in bed every night, hyper-aware of every sound, footsteps in the hallway, creaking floorboards, the whisper of fabric against skin. Even when they left me alone for days at a time, I couldn't relax, couldn't let my guard down, couldn't stop anticipating the next assault. My teaching suffered as exhaustion clouded my thinking. I made mistakes in lesson plans, forgot parent conferences, lost track of conversations mid-sentence. The principal, Mr. Henderson, called me into his office for a concerned discussion about my performance. Elena, you've been one of our most reliable teachers since you started here," he said, consulting a file folder that presumably contained documentation of my declining effectiveness. "But lately, several parents have expressed concerns about your classroom management and attention to detail. Is there something going on at home that's affecting your work?" Another opening. Another chance to reach out for help. Another opportunity to speak the truth that was poisoning me from the inside out. Just family stress. I said instead, the lies becoming easier with practice. "Dad and Mark are having a hard time adjusting to life without Mom, and I'm trying to help them through it. Things should settle down soon." Mr. Henderson nodded sympathetically and offered to arrange for substitute coverage if I needed time to deal with family issues, not realizing that time away from school would only trap me more completely with the men who were systematically destroying me. "Let me know if there's anything the school can do to support you during this difficult time," he said as I gathered my things to leave. "Margaret Richardson was a pillar of this community, and we want to make sure her daughter gets all the help she needs." Help! The word followed me home that afternoon, mocking and elusive. What kind of help could anyone provide when the threat came from within my own family, when the people who were supposed to protect me had become the source of my danger? That night, as I lay in bed waiting for footsteps that never came, I made a decision that would either save my life or end it. I was going to start documenting everything, every assault, every threat, every detail I could remember about their behavior and justifications. If I couldn't speak the truth aloud, yet at least I could preserve it on paper, creating a record that might someday serve as evidence or testimony, or simply proof that this nightmare had really happened. I didn't know it yet, but that decision to start keeping a secret journal would become the first step in my eventual escape. Sometimes survival begins with the smallest acts of rebellion, and mine began with a notebook hidden under my mattress and a commitment to bearing witness to my own destruction. Because if I was going to be destroyed, at least someone, even if it was only my future self, would know exactly how it happened and who was responsible. Winter settled over Millbrook like a heavy gray blanket mirroring the suffocating weight of my new reality. By December 1979, I had learned to move through the world like a ghost, haunting her own life present, but not truly there, going through the motions of normalcy while something essential inside me withered away day by day. The assaults followed no predictable pattern, which made them even more psychologically devastating. Sometimes a week would pass in blessed peace, long enough for me to almost convince myself the nightmare was ending. Then one of them would appear in my doorway at 2 a.m. and I'd be dragged back into hell without warning or mercy. They had refined their psychological manipulation into an art form, creating an elaborate mythology that painted their violence as love and my resistance as selfishness. "You're not crying as much as you used to," Dad observed one night in mid-December, his tone almost conversational as he buttoned his shirt afterward. "See, deep down, you're starting to understand that this is right. This is what families do for each other when times get hard. Mom would want us to comfort each other, Mark added, perched on the edge of my bed, like he was having a casual conversation about weekend plans. She'd be proud of how you're stepping up to take care of the men she left behind. That's what real love looks like, sacrifice without complaint. The lies were so persistent, so confidently delivered, that sometimes I caught myself wondering if they might contain some grain of truth. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just how families coped with devastating loss. Maybe I was the selfish one for wanting to preserve my own body and sanity instead of helping my grieving father and brother heal from their pain. But then, I'd remember Mom's gentle hands braiding my hair, her voice reading bedtime stories, her fierce protectiveness whenever anyone threatened her children. I knew with absolute certainty that she would have destroyed anyone who harmed me this way, that the woman who'd taught me about consent and self-respect would never have wanted me to sacrifice my body for anyone's comfort. That knowledge became my anchor, the single truth I could cling to when everything else turned fluid and uncertain. In January 1980, I began keeping the journal I'd planned writing in stolen moments and hiding my growing record beneath the mattress where they'd violated me so many times. The words poured out like poison from an infected wound. January 12, 1980. It happened again last night. Dad first, then Mark. They're getting bolder, talking about it afterward like it's perfectly normal family behavior. Mark said something about how I remind him of Mom in the dark, how touching me helps him feel close to her memory. I wanted to vomit. Mom would be horrified by what they're doing to me. She would never forgive them for twisting her death into justification for rape. January 18th. Tried to stay late at school for the after-school tutoring program, thinking they might leave me alone if I wasn't home until after dinner. Wrong. Mark was waiting in my room when I got back at 8 p.m., furious about the games I was playing. He said I couldn't avoid my family responsibilities forever, that trying to hide from them was disrespectful to Mom's memory. The word responsibilities makes my skin crawl now. Everything they do to me, they frame as my duty. January 25th, Mrs. Patterson asked again if I'm okay. She's noticed the weight loss, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jump at sudden noises. I want to tell her so badly, but what if she doesn't believe me? What if she calls Dad to discuss her concerns? In a town this small, there are no real secrets. Everyone talks to everyone else. I can't risk it. Not yet. February 3rd. Dad brought home flowers today, the same kind he used to buy for Mom on their anniversary. He put them in a vase on my dresser and said they were to thank me for being such a good daughter during this difficult time. The flowers are beautiful, and I hate them. I hate how he can be gentle and thoughtful during the day, then transform into a monster at night. I hate that part of me still craves his approval, still wants to believe that the father I loved is somehow still in there underneath this stranger who hurts me. February 10th. Mark got into a fight at Henley's garage today with a customer who made some crude comment about me. He came home with split knuckles and a black eye, proud of himself for defending my honor. The irony is so twisted, it makes me dizzy. He'll beat up strangers for disrespecting me, then violate me himself when the sun goes down. How do they reconcile these contradictions in their minds? How do they convince themselves they're protecting me while they're destroying me? The physical act of writing helped me process emotions too complex for conscious thought. Each entry was a small act of rebellion, a refusal to let their version of events become the only record of what was happening to me. The journal became my secret confidant, the one witness who couldn't doubt or judge or turn away in uncomfortable disbelief. By March, the isolation was becoming unbearable. I watched other people live their normal lives worrying about mortgage payments and relationship drama, and whether their favorite TV shows would be renewed, and felt like an alien observer studying a species I'd once belonged to but could never rejoin. The gulf between their reality and mine seemed insurmountable. That's when I made my first tentative attempt to reach beyond the prison of silence. Late one night, hands shaking with terror and desperate hope, I dialed the number I'd found in a pamphlet tucked inside a library book about domestic violence. The crisis hotline operator answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professionally calm. "Crisis Center, this is Sarah. How can I help you tonight?" The simple question unleashed a flood of tears I'd been holding back for months. I couldn't speak, at first, could only sob into the receiver, while Sarah waited patiently, offering gentle reassurances that I could take all the time I needed. "I don't know if this counts as the kind of problem you help with," I finally whispered, glancing toward my bedroom door to ensure I was alone. "It's not a husband or boyfriend doing this to me. It's my family. Abuse is abuse regardless of who's causing the harm," Sarah replied without hesitation, and those words hit me like a revelation. No one had ever used the word abuse to describe what was happening to me, not even in my own mind. "You deserve safety and support no matter what your relationship to the person hurting you. Can you tell me what's been happening?" I managed to share fragments of my story, careful not to provide identifying details, but desperate to have anyone, acknowledge that what I was experiencing was real and wrong and not my fault. "What you're describing is serious sexual abuse," she said gently when I finished my halting account. "None of this is your fault, and you deserve so much better than what you're enduring. Have you considered reporting this to the police?" The suggestion sent ice through my veins. "I can't. They're respected in our community. Dad's a veteran, never been in trouble with the law. Mark is popular, helps people, seems like the perfect son and brother to everyone who knows us. No one would believe that they're capable of this. I understand your concerns, and they're completely valid," Sarah assured me. Many survivors face those exact challenges, especially when the abuse is coming from family members. But there are resources available, shelters, financial assistance programs, legal advocates who specialize in these situations. "You don't have to face this alone." She gave me additional phone numbers and resources information I memorized and coded in my journal, using a system only I could decipher. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, and when I finally hung up, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer the only person who knew the truth about what was happening in the Richardson house. Someone else believed me, supported me, and considered me worth saving. That small validation gave me courage to start examining my situation more strategically, to look for weaknesses in their control that I might be able to exploit. During my lunch breaks, I began researching women's shelters in neighboring counties, calculating bus fare to larger cities, estimating the cost of starting over, with nothing but the clothes on my back. The numbers were daunting: first month's rent, security deposits, basic necessities, but for the first time, they seemed manageable rather than impossible. I had a teaching degree, which meant I could potentially find work anywhere. I had no criminal record, no history of instability beyond what they'd created through their abuse. I was young, healthy, and increasingly desperate enough to risk everything for the chance at freedom. But I would need money, and that's where their control was most complete. They monitored my paychecks, questioned every expenditure, and had made it clear that any attempt to establish financial independence would be seen as betrayal worthy of escalated punishment. "You don't need your own bank account," Dad had explained when I'd casually mentioned wanting to start saving money. "We're family. What's ours is yours, and what's yours is ours. That's how families work. We share everything, support each other through thick and thin." The twisted logic was perfect and impermeable. Any attempt to create boundaries or establish independence was reframed as selfishness, as a violation of family loyalty, as evidence that I didn't truly love or appreciate the sacrifices they were making for me. But something was stirring beneath the surface of my careful survival routine, some instinct that whispered change was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. Spring was approaching, bringing with it a restlessness I hadn't felt since before Mom's death. I found myself staring out classroom windows at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond the borders of Millbrook, imagining versions of myself that existed free from fear and shame. The weather warmed as April arrived, and with it came the first anniversary of Mom's initial cancer diagnosis. The date brought fresh waves of grief, but also something unexpected, a clearer memory of who she'd been, and what she taught me about strength, dignity, and self-worth. "You're stronger than you know, Elena Marie," she'd said during one of our last coherent conversations. "Life is going to test that strength in ways you can't imagine yet, but I have complete faith that you'll rise to meet whatever challenges come your way. You're my daughter, which means you've got iron in your backbone, even if you don't feel it yet." I was about to discover just how prophetic those words had been, and just how far a mother's love could reach beyond the grave to save a daughter she'd never be able to hold again. The revelation that would change everything came on April 23, 1980, during a thunderstorm that rattled our farmhouse windows and sent lightning crackling across the Indiana sky like nature's own warning system. I'd been looking through Dad's cluttered office desk for old family photographs to display at the upcoming church memorial service, marking 6 months since Mom's death. Mrs. Patterson thought it might help me process my grief to publicly celebrate Mom's memory. What I found instead shattered every assumption I'd made about my family's history and my current situation. Dad's desk had always been off limits during my childhood, a masculine sanctuary cluttered with plant manuals, tax documents, and mysterious papers that seemed impossibly important to adult concerns. But grief and trauma had made me bolder, more willing to cross boundaries that once seemed absolute. I was no longer the obedient daughter who asked permission before touching Dad's belongings. The photographs were buried beneath months of unopened mail and forgotten receipts, but as I dug deeper, my fingers brushed against something that made my blood freeze, a manila envelope marked "Margaret, Medical Records," in Mom's careful handwriting. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, not just her cancer treatment records, but psychiatric evaluations, police reports, and medical files dating back 15 years. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first page, expecting to find routine medical information. Instead, I discovered evidence of a pattern of violence that had been hidden from me my entire life. Emergency room report, St. Mary's Hospital, March 15, 1965. Patient Margaret Ann Richardson, age 35, injuries, contusions to left shoulder and upper arm consistent with grip marks. Minor lacerations to scalp. Patient claims she fell down basement stairs but injury pattern inconsistent with reported mechanism. Notes: this is patient's third ER visit in 18 months for injuries she attributes to household accidents. Recommend social services consultation. Police report. Millbrook PD, August 22, 1967, domestic disturbance call to 1247 County Road, 18. Margaret Richardson called to report husband Robert Richardson having one of his episodes. Officers arrived to find wife with visible bruising to face and arms. Robert Richardson calm and cooperative, no signs of intoxication. Margaret Richardson declined to press charges, stated she provoked the situation and wanted no further involvement from law enforcement. Psychiatric evaluation. Dr. James Morrison, M.D., November 3, 1971. Patient presents with symptoms consistent with chronic anxiety and depression. Reports ongoing marital difficulties and fears for her safety and that of her children. Husband has history of violent outbursts triggered by work stress or reminders of his own childhood trauma. Patient describes walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring husband's mood, protecting children from witnessing his dark episodes. Recommendation: individual therapy, possible marital counseling, safety planning in case of escalation. The documents painted a horrifying picture of the marriage I'd thought was loving and stable. Mom hadn't died peacefully in a happy home. She'd died trapped in an abusive relationship she'd spent decades trying to manage and conceal. The gentle father I remembered, the man who'd seemed broken by grief after her death, had actually been her tormentor for most of their marriage. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. At the bottom of the envelope, sealed in a smaller manila folder marked, "For Elena, emergency only," were letters Mom had written but never sent, documenting her growing fears about what would happen to me after her death. January 8, 1979. The cancer is getting worse, and I'm running out of time to protect Elena from what Robert will become when I'm no longer here to contain his violence. He's never touched her inappropriately, but I see how he looks at her sometimes. The same predatory assessment his father used to direct at his sisters before he started visiting their bedrooms at night. The Richardson men have a sickness that passes from father to son, a twisted understanding of what it means to own and control the women in their lives. February 20th, 1979. Mark is showing the same signs, now the same possessive anger toward Elena that Robert used to show toward me when we were first married. He guards her like property, gets furious when other men show interest in her talks about how she belongs to this family in ways that make my skin crawl. I'm afraid they've already decided what her role will be once I'm gone. March 30th, 1979. I've been researching women's shelters and legal aid organizations, creating a network of resources Elena can access if my worst fears come true. The money I've been saving in the secret account should be enough for her to escape if she needs to, but I pray she'll never have to use it. I pray I'm wrong about Robert and Mark, that grief won't strip away the thin veneer of civilization that's been holding their darker impulses in check. September 15th, 1979. I'm dying, and there's nothing I can do to prevent what's coming. Robert's behavior has become increasingly erratic as my condition worsens. He's drinking more, his temper is shorter, and twice. Now I've caught him staring at Elena with an expression that turns my stomach. Mark has started making comments about how Elena will have to step up when I'm gone, how she'll need to take care of the family in all the ways that matter. They think I don't understand what they're planning, but I understand perfectly. I understand, and I'm powerless to stop it. The final letter was dated just 3 days before Mom's death, written in handwriting that was already shaky from medication and approaching organ failure. My darling Elena, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and the men I tried so hard to protect you from have shown their true nature. I'm so sorry I won't be there to defend you. So sorry I couldn't find a way to remove you from danger before I died. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. The sickness in Robert and Mark isn't something you caused or deserve. It's an inherited poison that's been passed down through generations of Richardson men. A twisted understanding of power and control that turns love into ownership and family into prison. The account information is in the envelope with this letter. There's enough money for a bus ticket to Indianapolis or Chicago and several months of basic living expenses while you establish independence. I've also included contact information for women's organizations that help survivors escape family violence. I've researched them carefully, and they will believe you and support you when you're ready to run. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of a life free from fear and violence. Don't let their sickness convince you otherwise. Don't let them tell you that submission is love, or that their needs matter more than your safety. Run, my darling girl. Run as far and as fast as you can, and never look back. Build a life that would make your mother proud, a life filled with genuine love, honest work, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you survived hell and chose heaven instead. All my love forever, Mom. Thunder crashed overhead as I finished reading, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Mom had known. She'd seen the monsters lurking beneath familiar faces and had tried to prepare me for what was coming. Her death hadn't unleashed their violence. It had simply removed the last obstacle preventing them from acting on desires they'd been harboring for years. The bank account information was there just as she'd promised. A modest sum, $4,300, but enough to represent genuine freedom if I could access it. Mom's research had provided a roadmap to resources I'd never known existed, complete with phone numbers, addresses, and detailed instructions for safely leaving an abusive situation. For the first time since November, I felt something other than despair flooding through my system. This wasn't just validation of my suffering. It was proof that escape had always been possible, that Mom's love had reached beyond death to provide exactly what I needed to save myself. But as I carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, I heard footsteps on the stairs and realized I wasn't alone in the house. Dad was supposed to be at work. Mark was supposed to be at the garage. But someone was coming up the steps toward the office where I knelt surrounded by evidence of their carefully hidden family pathology. The footsteps paused outside the door, and I held my breath, praying whoever it was would continue down the hallway without investigating what I was doing in Dad's private space. But after a long moment, the door opened, and Mark's voice filled the room. "Find what you were looking for, Elena." He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his tone carrying undercurrents of threat that made my newly discovered courage waver. How long had he been watching me? How much had he seen? Did he know about the secret account about Mom's letters about the escape plan that was forming in my mind? "Just looking for pictures for the memorial service," I said as steadily as possible, hoping my voice didn't betray the terror coursing through my veins. "Mrs. Patterson thought it would be nice to display some family photos. In Dad's medical files." Mark stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing like a gunshot in the enclosed space. "That's a strange place to look for photographs, don't you think?" He knew. Somehow, someway he knew I'd discovered their secrets, and the predatory smile spreading across his face told me that my window of opportunity was closing faster than I'd imagined possible. "What did you find, Elena?" he asked, moving closer with the patient grace of a cat stalking wounded prey. "What did our dear departed mother leave behind for you to discover?" I was trapped, physically cornered in a room, with no other exit, psychologically overwhelmed by the realization that my moment of triumph was about to become another chapter in their ongoing campaign of control and violence. But something had changed in me during those few minutes of reading Mom's letters. I'd tasted the possibility of freedom, felt the weight of her love and belief in my strength, and that knowledge had awakened something that months of abuse hadn't been able to kill. "She left me the truth," I said, quietly meeting his gaze without flinching, for the first time since this nightmare began. "The truth about what you and Dad really are, what you've always been, and what you planned to do to me long before she died." His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And what exactly do you plan to do with that truth, little sister?" The answer that came to me was clear and absolute, spoken with a certainty that surprised us both. "I'm going to use it to destroy you." Mark's laughter filled the small office like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and dangerous, and completely without humor. "Destroy us, Elena, you sweet, naive little girl. You can't even save yourself, and you think you can hurt us." He moved closer, backing me against Dad's filing cabinet until I could smell the motor oil and cigarettes that always clung to his work clothes. But instead of the usual fear that paralyzed me during these confrontations, I felt something else, a cold, clear anger that seemed to radiate from the place where Mom's words had taken root in my chest. "I have evidence now," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Medical records, police reports, letters documenting everything. People will have to believe me when there's official documentation to back up my claims." "Will they?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was an interesting specimen in a laboratory. "Because I'm looking at a young woman who's been unstable since her mother's death, who's been acting erratically at work, who's clearly been going through private family documents without permission. That doesn't exactly scream credible witness to me." The casual cruelty of his logic hit me like a physical blow. Even with Mom's evidence, even with official documentation of the family's history of violence, he was right about the fundamental imbalance of power between us. I was still the dependent daughter, still the grief-stricken young woman whose behavior had already raised concerns among my colleagues. Plus, he continued reaching behind me to pull open the filing cabinet drawer. "You're assuming those documents are going to remain available for you to share with anyone." My heart sank as I watched him remove the manila envelope containing Mom's letters and evidence, holding it just out of my reach with the satisfied expression of someone who just solved a troublesome problem. "You were sloppy, Elena. You left everything sitting out where anyone could find it. What kind of person goes through a grieving man's private papers without permission? What kind of daughter violates her dead mother's medical privacy like that?" He was rewriting the narrative in real time, transforming my discovery of evidence into my violation of their privacy, making me the aggressor in a situation where I was clearly the victim. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind, and I could feel my newfound confidence beginning to crumble under the weight of his manipulation. "Those letters are addressed to me," I protested, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "Mom wrote them for me to find. She wanted me to know the truth about what you and Dad really are." "Mom was dying and heavily medicated when she wrote these," Mark replied, flipping through the documents with casual indifference. "Morphine causes hallucinations, paranoid delusions, false memories. Any doctor will tell you that dying cancer patients often create elaborate fantasies about the people they believe have wronged them." The reframing was so smooth, so plausible, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. What if Mom had been delusional? What if the medical records were misinterpreted? What if I was building my escape plan on the foundation of a sick woman's drug-induced paranoia? But then I remembered the careful dates and details in her letters, the way they aligned perfectly with my own observations about Dad and Mark's behavior. I remembered the bank account she'd established, the research she'd conducted, the practical resources she'd assembled, none of which suggested delusion or paranoia. "She wasn't delusional," I said with growing conviction. "She saw what you really were, and she tried to protect me from it. That's why she saved money, why she researched shelters, why she documented everything she could about your behavior." Mark's expression shifted from amusement to something colder and more dangerous. "You know what I think, Elena? I think you've been under too much stress lately. I think losing Mom broke something in your mind, made you start seeing threats where none exist, imagining problems that aren't real." He moved closer, crowding me against the filing cabinet until I had nowhere to retreat. "I think you need help, professional help, the kind of help they provide at state psychiatric facilities for young women who've had complete mental breakdowns." The threat was perfectly crafted, exploiting every fear that had kept me silent for months. In 1980, a woman could be committed to a psychiatric institution based on the testimony of male family members, especially if she'd been exhibiting erratic behavior and making outrageous accusations against respected community members. "Dad and I have been talking," Mark continued, his voice dropping to the intimate whisper he used during assaults. "We're concerned about your mental state about these fantasies you've been having about our family. We think you might be dangerous to yourself, to us, to those innocent children you teach every day." I felt the trap closing around me with mechanical precision. They'd been planning this conversation, preparing for the possibility that I might discover Mom's evidence or attempt to expose their crimes. Every argument I could make would be dismissed as further proof of my instability, every piece of evidence reframed as delusion or manipulation. "We love you too much to let you hurt yourself with these destructive fantasies," he said, reaching up to stroke my cheek with mock tenderness. "That's why we're going to get you the help you need, whether you want it or not. Tomorrow morning, we're driving you to Logansport State Hospital for a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation." Logansport. I knew that name from whispered conversations among teachers, from cautionary tales about what happened to women who couldn't cope with life's pressures. It was the place where inconvenient females disappeared, where families sent daughters and wives who asked too many questions or made too many demands. Once you were committed to Logansport, getting out again required the permission of the same family members who'd put you there in the first place. "You can't do that," I whispered, but we both knew he could. They could and would, unless I found a way to stop them in the next 18 hours. "We can and we will," Mark confirmed, tucking Mom's envelope inside his jacket. "For your own good, of course, because we love you and want what's best for you." He left me alone in the office, presumably to share his discovery with Dad, and finalize their plans for my commitment. I sat on the floor where he'd left me, surrounded by the scattered remnants of my brief hope, trying to process the magnitude of the disaster that had just unfolded. Mom's evidence was gone. My window of opportunity was closing. In less than 24 hours, I would be committed to a psychiatric facility where my claims of abuse would be dismissed as symptoms of mental illness, where I would be drugged and isolated and potentially lost forever. But as I sat there in the gathering twilight, something unexpected happened. Instead of the familiar despair that usually followed their psychological victories, I felt a strange calm settling over me. Maybe it was because I'd finally seen proof that I wasn't crazy, that Mom had recognized the same threats I was experiencing. Maybe it was because I'd tasted the possibility of freedom, however briefly, and now knew it was real, even if it seemed impossible to achieve. Or maybe it was because I finally understood that this was war, and in war, you don't survive by playing defense forever. Eventually, you have to attack. I thought about Mom's letters about her research into women's shelters and legal aid organizations. Mark might have taken the physical documents, but he couldn't erase what I'd learned from reading them. I still knew about the secret bank account, still remembered the phone numbers and addresses Mom had compiled. More importantly, I now understood something that had been hidden from me my entire life. This family had a long history of violence that extended far beyond what they'd done to me. There were medical records, police reports, documentation of a pattern that went back decades. Even if Mark destroyed Mom's copies, the original records still existed in hospital files and police archives. I wasn't just fighting for my own freedom anymore. I was fighting to expose a generational cycle of abuse that had been hidden behind the facade of respectability for far too long. And that meant the stakes were higher than just my personal survival. As darkness fell over Millbrook, I began to formulate a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on your perspective. I had roughly 12 hours before they planned to take me to Logansport, 12 hours to either escape or create enough evidence of their crimes that my commitment would be impossible to accomplish quietly. It was going to be the longest night of my life, but it might also be my last chance to save not just myself, but every other woman who might fall victim to the Richardson family legacy of violence. The war was about to begin in earnest, and I was finally ready to fight. The final battle began at 11:47 p.m. on April 23, 1980, during a thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of our farmhouse. I had spent the hours since Mark's confrontation in careful preparation, gathering every piece of evidence I could find, and planning an escape route that would either save my life or end it in the attempt. I'd managed to retrieve some of Mom's research from her sewing box where she'd hidden duplicate copies of the most important documents. Not everything Mark had been thorough in his confiscation, but enough to provide credible proof of the family's history of violence. I'd also used the phone in the school principal's office during my evening return to grade papers to contact the crisis hotline and arrange for emergency shelter placement in Indianapolis. "We'll have someone waiting at the Greyhound station," Sarah had assured me during our whispered conversation. "But Elena, I need you to understand the most dangerous time for any abuse victim is when they're trying to leave. If they've threatened you with institutionalization, they're not going to let you walk away quietly." I understood the risks, but I also understood that staying meant certain destruction. Better to die fighting for freedom than to disappear quietly into the psychiatric system where my voice would be silenced forever. The storm that had been building all evening reached its peak around midnight, rain lashing the windows and wind howling through the old house's many gaps and crevices. I lay in bed fully dressed, clutching a backpack containing my journal, Mom's recovered documents, and the few possessions I couldn't bear to leave behind. Every nerve in my body was electrified with anticipation and terror. They came for me at 12:15 a.m. earlier than I'd expected, and in a coordinated assault that suggested they'd been planning this moment for hours. Dad appeared first, silhouetted in my doorway like a nightmare given human form. "Tiens, time to go, Elena," he said quietly, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd already won the battle. "Mark's got the car warmed up. We're going to take a little ride to get you the help you need." "It's the middle of the night," I protested, hoping to buy time while I calculated distances and possibilities. "Hospitals don't admit patients at midnight unless it's an emergency." "This is an emergency," Mark said, appearing behind Dad with a set of restraints that made my blood freeze. "You're a danger to yourself and others, Elena. We can't wait until morning to get you proper medical attention." The restraints told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. This wasn't going to be a voluntary admission for evaluation. This was going to be an involuntary commitment based on their testimony about my violent and erratic behavior. Once I was strapped down in the back of their car, my fate would be sealed. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, standing up from my bed with the backpack clutched to my chest like a shield. "I know what you're planning, and I know what you've been doing to me for months. I have evidence now, proof of what this family really is." Dad laughed, the sound cold and empty in the darkness. "Evidence? You mean those fantasy letters your dying mother wrote while she was high on morphine? The medical records you stole from my private files? No one's going to believe the word of a mentally unstable young woman against two respected members of this community. They'll believe official hospital records." I shot back, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "They'll believe police reports and medical documentation going back 15 years. Mom wasn't delusional, she was keeping track of your crimes." Mark stepped forward with the restraints, his expression shifting from mock concern to barely contained violence. "Enough talking. We tried to do this the easy way, but you're not going to cooperate. Time for the hard way." That's when everything exploded into chaos. I'd been planning my escape route for hours, memorizing every obstacle between my bedroom and the back door, calculating the timing I'd need to reach my car before they could stop me. But what I hadn't planned for was the way terror and desperation would sharpen every sense, slow down time, and flood my system with strength I didn't know I possessed. When Mark lunged for me with the restraints, I was already moving, swinging my backpack into his face with every ounce of force I could muster. The heavy books inside connected with his nose in a sound like breaking celery, sending him staggering backward with blood streaming down his face. "You little bitch!" he roared, but I was already past him, running for the hallway where Dad stood blocking my path to the stairs. At 51, Dad was still strong from decades of factory work, but he was also drunk and overconfident, expecting me to crumble under his authority like I'd done so many times before. He wasn't prepared for the desperate fury of a woman who'd finally decided that death was preferable to continued captivity. I hit him with the kind of tackle I'd learned watching Mark play high school football, driving my shoulder into his midsection and using his own momentum to send him crashing into the hallway wall. His head connected with the wooden banister in a sound that would haunt my dreams for years afterward, and he dropped to the floor in a heap of limbs and groaning consciousness. Behind me, Mark was bellowing threats and promises of retribution, but his broken nose was making it difficult for him to breathe or see clearly. I had perhaps 30 seconds before he recovered enough to pursue me, 30 seconds to reach my car and start the engine and escape into the storm-lashed night. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, adrenaline making everything appear crystal clear and hyper-focused. The back door was 15 feet away, then 10, then 5, and then I was outside in the rain and wind running across the muddy yard toward my little Honda Civic parked beside the barn. The keys were in my hand. The door was opening. The engine was turning over with a reluctant cough that sounded like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. In the rearview mirror, I could see lights blazing in the house and figures moving behind the windows. But I was moving too, backing out of the driveway and onto County Road 18 with gravel spraying from my tires. But my escape had come at a cost I hadn't fully calculated. In my desperate flight, I'd left behind more than just the house where I'd been victimized. I'd left behind any possibility of a quiet disappearance, any chance of avoiding public scrutiny of what had happened in the Richardson family home. Dad might be seriously injured from his fall. Mark was certainly injured and furious. They would call the police, report me as mentally unstable and dangerous, claim I'd attacked them without provocation during some kind of psychotic episode. By morning, there would be a warrant out for my arrest, and every law enforcement officer in 3 counties would be looking for Elena Richardson, the disturbed young woman who'd assaulted her own family. But as I drove through the darkness toward an uncertain future, rain pounding against my windshield and lightning illuminating the empty farmland around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. Not the desperate fantasy of escape I'd been nurturing in secret, but real concrete possibility based on evidence and planning, and my own proven ability to fight back when fighting became necessary. I was free. Scared, homeless, probably about to become a fugitive, but free. And for the first time since Mom's death, I believed I might actually survive this nightmare with my soul intact. The Greyhound station in Peoria was 40 minutes away through back roads that would be difficult for police to monitor. Sarah from the crisis center had promised someone would be waiting, someone who would help me navigate the legal and practical challenges of escaping family violence. As I drove through the storm toward whatever came next, I thought about Mom's letters, about her faith in my strength, and her belief that I could survive whatever hell awaited me. She'd been right. I was stronger than I'd known, braver than I'd believed, and worthy of a life free from fear and violence. The hardest part was over. The war was won. Now, all I had to do was survive the aftermath and build something beautiful from the wreckage they tried to make of my life. But first, I had to make it through the next few hours without being captured, committed, or killed by the men whose crimes I was finally ready to expose to the world. The real battle was just beginning. The Greyhound station in Peoria at 2:30 a.m. was nothing more than a fluorescent-lit waiting room with hard plastic chairs and vending machines, but to me, it represented sanctuary, the first safe space I'd occupied in 6 months. Sarah had kept her promise. A woman named Jennifer Martinez from the Indianapolis Women's Crisis Center was waiting with a bus ticket, clean clothes, and the kind of professional compassion that didn't require me to perform gratitude or explain why I'd endured abuse for so long. "You made it," Jennifer said, simply embracing me with the careful gentleness of someone who understood that unexpected touch could trigger panic in trauma survivors. "That took incredible courage, Elena. How are you holding up?" The question unleashed tears I'd been holding back during the 40-minute drive through rural Indiana. But these were tears of relief rather than despair. For the first time in months, I was crying in the presence of someone who believed me, supported me, and considered my safety more important than family reputation or community harmony. I think I seriously hurt my father. I managed between sobs, the reality of what I'd done finally hitting me now that the immediate danger had passed. He hit his head when I tackled him, and there was blood. What if he's badly injured? What if I've committed a crime? "Self-defense isn't a crime," Jennifer assured me, guiding me toward a corner where we could talk privately while waiting for the 3:15 a.m. bus to Indianapolis. "You were protecting yourself from people who had threatened to have you involuntarily committed to prevent you from exposing their abuse. Any reasonable prosecutor would see that your actions were justified." But even as she spoke, I could see the concern in her eyes. The legal system in 1980 wasn't kind to women who fought back against family violence, especially when that violence came from respected male community members. I would need more than self-defense claims to survive the legal battle that was surely coming. "I have evidence," I told her, pulling Mom's recovered documents from my backpack with trembling hands. "Medical records, police reports, letters documenting a history of abuse going back decades. My mother knew what they were and tried to protect me before she died." Jennifer's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents, her professional composure giving way to genuine shock at the extent of evidence Mom had assembled. "This is extraordinary." she murmured, studying a police report from 1967 that documented Dad's violence toward Mom. Most survivors of family abuse have no documentation at all, which makes their cases almost impossible to prosecute. But this is a prosecutor's dream. A clear pattern of escalating violence with official documentation spanning 15 years. The bus ride to Indianapolis passed in a blur of small-town landscapes and highway rest stops, Jennifer briefing me on what to expect during the intake process at the women's shelter and the legal procedures that would follow my decision to press charges. By the time we reached the city, I had a clearer understanding of the resources available to me and the challenges I would face in the coming months. The Indianapolis Women's Crisis Center was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a place where my story wasn't questioned or minimized, where other survivors shared their own experiences of family violence, where healing was understood to be a process rather than a destination. For the first time since Mom's death, I was surrounded by people who understood the complexity of trauma and the courage required for survival. "Your case is going to attract attention," warned Detective Sarah Morrison during my first interview with Indianapolis police 3 days after my escape. Family violence cases always generate controversy, but when the perpetrators are respected community members and the victim has physically fought back, the media tends to get involved. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I wasn't prepared, but I was determined. The alternative, staying silent while Dad and Mark continued their pattern of abuse, was no longer acceptable to me. If exposing their crimes meant facing public judgment, so be it. The legal proceedings that followed were grueling in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dad survived his head injury with a concussion and some stitches, but he and Mark immediately filed countercharges, claiming I'd attacked them during a psychotic episode brought on by grief and mental instability. Their version of events painted me as the aggressor, a disturbed young woman who'd concocted elaborate fantasies to justify violence against her own family. "They're claiming you made up the abuse allegations to cover for your unprovoked assault," my attorney Linda Rodriguez explained during one of our preparation sessions. "They've gotten statements from people in Millbrook who say you've been acting strangely since your mother's death, that you've seemed paranoid and unstable." But Mom's evidence proved impossible for them to discredit. The medical records were official hospital documents, the police reports were filed in government archives, and the pattern they revealed was too consistent and detailed to dismiss as delusion or fabrication. When combined with my journal entries and the testimony of crisis center counselors who'd spoken with me before my escape, the prosecution had a case that even the best defense attorneys couldn't effectively challenge. The trial began in September 1980, 6 months after my escape, and lasted for 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. I sat in the witness stand for 3 days, recounting every detail of the abuse, while Dad and Mark sat at the defendant's table in their best suits, looking like the respectable community members they'd always pretended to be. "Can you tell the court about the night of April 23rd when you allegedly defended yourself against your father and brother?" the prosecutor asked during my direct examination. They came to my room with restraints. I testified, my voice steady, despite the weight of every gaze in the courtroom. They were planning to take me to Logansport State Hospital for involuntary psychiatric commitment to prevent me from exposing their abuse. I knew that if I got in that car, I would never be seen again. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, designed to paint me as a mentally unstable young woman seeking attention through false accusations. But every attack on my credibility was undermined by the documentary evidence Mom had left behind, and by the expert testimony of psychologists who explained how family abuse operates differently from stranger violence. When the guilty verdicts were read, sexual assault, criminal confinement, and conspiracy for both defendants, I felt no triumph, only a profound exhaustion that reached to my bones. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo what had been done or restore what had been stolen. Dad received 15 years in state prison. Mark got 12. It seemed both too much and too little for the magnitude of their crimes. The aftermath brought its own challenges. News of the trial had spread throughout Indiana and neighboring states, making me a public figure in ways I never wanted to be. Some people expressed support and admiration for my courage in speaking out, But others whispered that I must have done something to encourage the attacks that family business should stay within families, that sending my own father and brother to prison proved I was vindictive and unnatural. I never returned to Millbrook permanently. There was nothing left for me there except memories that would always carry poison and a community divided between those who supported me and those who blamed me for destroying a good family with my accusations. Instead, I used the modest Victims' Compensation Award to finish my master's degree in social work, specializing in trauma recovery and family violence intervention. The Women's Crisis Center, where I'd found safety, became my professional home, and eventually the foundation for everything I would build in the years that followed. I started as a volunteer counselor, sharing my story with newly arrived survivors who needed to hear that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, that their lives could extend beyond the violence that had defined them. Speaking publicly about sexual abuse was terrifying at first, but it became easier as I realized how desperately other women needed to hear that they weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't irreparably damaged by what had been done to them. My testimony during legislative hearings led to changes in Indiana's laws regarding family violence and involuntary psychiatric commitment, making it harder for abusers to use the mental health system as a weapon against their victims. But the most important discovery was that survival could become purpose, that the worst experiences of my life could be transformed into the foundation for helping others escape similar situations. Every successful case at the crisis center felt like a small victory against the forces that had once seemed omnipotent in my own life. The healing process was neither quick nor linear. Some days I felt strong and confident, ready to take on the world. Other days I could barely get out of bed, overwhelmed by memories and anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. But gradually, with therapy and support and the passage of time, I began to rebuild something that resembled a normal life. I learned to trust again, carefully, gradually, with appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations. I found work that gave my life meaning beyond mere survival. I built relationships with people who understood that recovery was an ongoing process, not a destination you reached and then maintained without effort. And slowly, very slowly, I began to believe that I might deserve the kind of life Mom had wanted for me, a life filled with genuine love, honest work, and the peace that comes from knowing you survived hell, and chose to use that survival to help others find their own way to freedom. Today, as I write these words on a crisp October morning in 2025, I am 66 years old and serving as the Executive Director of Richardson Family Services, a nationwide network of crisis centers and legal advocacy programs that has helped over 85,000 survivors of family violence build new lives free from fear and abuse. The organization that bears my family name now represents hope instead of horror, transformation instead of trauma. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate wasn't quick or easy. It took years of therapy to process the full impact of what Dad and Mark had done to me, years of legal battles to establish precedents that would protect other survivors, years of personal growth to understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past define your future. I married David Rodriguez, Linda's younger brother, in 1987 after a courtship that lasted 3 years because I needed that much time to trust that love didn't have to involve ownership or control. David understood instinctively that some days required more gentleness than others, that anniversaries and thunderstorms could trigger memories I couldn't control, that healing happened in fits and starts rather than straight lines. We never had children of our own, but our work provided all the parenting opportunities we could handle. The young women who came through our programs often stayed in our lives long after their immediate crises had passed, creating an extended family, bound not by blood, but by shared survival and mutual support. I may not have given birth to biological children, but I've helped raise hundreds of daughters who learned from my example that strength can emerge from the worst circumstances. Dad died in prison in 1992, after serving 12 years of his sentence, lung cancer, probably caused by decades of exposure to industrial chemicals at the Caterpillar plant. I didn't attend his funeral, felt no obligation to forgive or forget, experienced no deathbed reconciliation movie moments. Some wounds don't heal through closure. They heal through the deliberate construction of a life that makes them irrelevant. Mark was released in 1992 after serving his full 12-year sentence and has since remarried, started a family, and apparently found some version of redemption through fatherhood and community service. He sends a letter every year on the anniversary of my escape apologizing for his actions and asking for forgiveness. I'm not obligated to provide. I don't respond to these letters, but I don't throw them away either. They serve as a reminder that people can change, even if that change comes too late to repair the damage they've caused. But the story doesn't end with justice served or personal healing achieved. Last month, on September 15th, 2025, exactly 46 years after Mom wrote her final letter, warning me about what was coming, I received a package that would prove to be the final chapter in a story I thought had ended decades ago. The package came from an attorney in Fort Wayne, Indiana, representing the estate of Father James Williams, the Methodist pastor, who had officiated Mom's funeral and counseled our family through the worst period of our lives. Father Williams had died at age 93, and among his personal effects were items he'd been asked to hold, until the time was right, by a woman named Margaret Richardson in 1979. Inside the attorney's package was a small wooden box, hand-carved and polished to a warm glow, containing items I'd never seen before: Mom's wedding ring, which I'd thought was buried with her, a deed to 20 acres of farmland in southern Indiana that she'd inherited from her parents and never mentioned, and one final letter, sealed with wax and marked, "For Elena Richardson on her 66th birthday, or upon the establishment of her life's work, whichever comes first." My hands shook as I opened the envelope, reading words Mom had written in the final weeks of her life, but kept hidden for nearly half a century. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then you have not only survived the hell I knew was coming, but you have transformed that survival into something that would make your mother prouder than words can express. Father Williams has instructions to give you this letter only when you have either reached your 66th birthday or established a life's work dedicated to helping others, and the fact that you're reading it now tells me you have achieved both. The land deed in this box represents 20 acres of rich farmland near Bloomington, purchased with my inheritance from your grandparents and held in trust for you all these years. It's enough space for a retreat center, a training facility, or whatever vision you have for expanding the work that I knew you would eventually dedicate your life to. But more than property, I want to give you the knowledge that your mother saw exactly who you would become, even in the darkest moments of my final illness. I knew you would survive what was coming because I saw in you the same strength that carried me through 15 years of abuse at your father's hands. I knew you would help others because I saw in you the same compassion that made you willing to sacrifice yourself for people you loved. Most importantly, I knew you would find a way to transform the Richardson name from a source of shame into a symbol of hope, because I saw in you the kind of courage that refuses to let evil have the final word in any story. The retreat center can be built on the highest hill of the property where the sunrise illuminates the entire valley every morning. I want you to call it the Margaret Center, not to honor me, but to honor the truth that mother's love can reach across death to protect and provide for their children when they need it most. You are my miracle, Elena Marie Richardson. You were my miracle when you were born, my miracle every day you were growing up, and my miracle now as you use your pain to heal the world. I am so grateful that you are my daughter, so proud of the woman you became, and so amazed by the life you built from the ashes of trauma. Live fully, my darling girl. Love deeply. Trust the strength you've proven you possess. And know that somewhere beyond death, your mother is watching you change the world, one survivor at a time. All my love forever and always, Mom. I wept as I finished reading tears of grief for the mother I still missed after 46 years, tears of gratitude for her final gift, and tears of awe at the realization that her love had been orchestrating my salvation from before the moment of my birth. The Margaret Center opened in the spring of 2025, built on the highest hill of Mom's land, where the sunrise illuminates the entire valley every morning. It serves as a retreat and training facility for survivors of family violence, a place where women can heal in safety while learning the skills they need to become advocates and counselors themselves. On the wall of the center's main conference room hangs a plaque with Mom's final words to me, and below it, a mission statement that captures everything I've learned about survival healing and hope. The Richardson Family Services mission is simple: to ensure that no woman suffers in silence, no child grows up afraid, and no family legacy of violence continues for another generation. We believe that survival can become purpose, that trauma can be transformed into strength, and that real love, is always more powerful than fear. As I prepare to step down as executive director next year and transition into an advisory role, I know that the work will continue because it must continue. Every day, somewhere in America, a young woman is discovering that the people who are supposed to protect her have become the source of her greatest danger. Every day, someone needs to hear that escape is possible, that healing is achievable, that their life can extend beyond the violence that has defined them. The miracle Mom promised me wasn't a single moment of divine intervention. It was a lifetime of small victories that eventually added up to something that looked like redemption. My miracle was discovering that I was stronger than I knew, braver than I believed, and worthy of a life free from fear and violence. If you're reading this story and recognizing pieces of your own experience in mine, please know your miracle is waiting for you to claim it. The path out of darkness is never easy, but it is always possible. Reach out, ask for help. Take that first terrifying step toward freedom. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of a life that would make your own mother proud, whether she's here to see it or watching from whatever place love goes when it transcends the boundaries of life and death. Your story doesn't have to end with suffering. Like mine, it can become a testament to the unbreakable power of the human spirit and the miraculous truth that even the worst experiences can be transformed into the foundation for helping others find their way to safety, healing, and hope. The miracle isn't that we survive. The miracle is that we survive and choose to use that survival to ensure others don't have to suffer alone.